Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to Freeform Fridays with Fraggeth. I am your host, Fraggeth, your narrator, if you will. Um, the past couple weeks, I've been reading short stories from Greg Egan's short story collection, Axiomatic. I'm going to continue that. I'd like to continue doing that until I have done the entire book. We're about a quarter to a third of the way through now. So a few more weeks of this, and then we will figure out what I want to do after that. I'll probably go back to reading some pulp stories, or I could do entire novels if people want. I am down for whatever. Anything people want. Do do leave a message or speak your piece. So this week we will be going through, at the very least, Blood Sisters. Um, as well as probably the titular uh, story of Axiomatic by the same name, Axiomatic, because that one is also pretty doable, and we'll see how we're doing from there. Um, might do the next one in line, which is, I think, the safe deposit box, if memory serves. We'll see how we're doing, and we'll go from there. All right. Figure we can begin. Blood Sisters by Greg Egan. When we were 9 years old, Paula decided that we should prick our thumbs and let our blood flow into each other's veins. I was scornful. Why bother? Our blood's already exactly the same. We're already blood sisters. She was unfazed. I know that. That's not the point. It's the ritual that counts. We did it in our bedroom, at midnight, by the light of a single candle. She sterilized the needle in the candle flame, then wiped it clean of soot with a tissue and saliva. When we'd pressed the sticky, tiny wounds together and recited some ridiculous oath from a third-rate children's novel, Paula blew out the candle. While my eyes were still adjusting to the dark, she added a whispered coda of her own. Now we'll dream the same dreams, and share the same lovers, and die at the very same hour. I tried to say indignantly, that's just not true, but the darkness and the scent of the dead flame made the protest stick in my throat, and her words remained unchallenged. As Dr. Packard spoke, I folded the pathology report into halves, into quarters, obsessively aligning the edges. It was far too thick for me to make a neat job of it, from the micrographs of the misshapen lymphocytes proliferating in my bone marrow, to the printout of portions of the RNA sequence of the virus that had triggered the disease, 32 pages in all. In contrast, the prescription, still sitting on the desk in front of me, seemed ludicrously flimsy and insubstantial. No match at all. The traditional, indecipherable, polysyllabic scrawl it bore was nothing but a decoration. The drug's name was reliably encrypted in the barcode below. There was no question of receiving the wrong medication by mistake. The question was, would the right one help me? Is that clear, Ms. Rees? Is there anything you don't understand? I struggled to focus my thoughts, pressing hard on an intractable crease with my thumb. She'd explained the situation frankly, without resorting to jargon or euphemism, but I still had the feeling that I was missing something crucial. It seemed like every sentence she'd spoken had started in one of two ways: the virus or the drug. Is there anything I can do, myself, to improve the odds? She hesitated, but not for long. No, not really. You're in excellent health otherwise. Stay that way. She began to rise from her desk to dismiss me, and I began to panic. There must be something. I gripped the arms of my chair, as if afraid of being dislodged by force. Maybe she'd misunderstood me. Maybe I hadn't made myself clear. Should I stop eating certain foods? Get more exercise? Get more sleep? I mean, there has to be something that will make a difference, and I'll do it, whatever it is. Please, just tell me. My voice almost cracked, and I looked away, embarrassed. Don't ever start ranting like that again. Not ever. Miss Rees, I'm sorry. I know how you must be feeling. But the Monte Carlo diseases are all like this. In fact, you're exceptionally lucky. The WHO computer found 80,000 people worldwide infected with a similar strain. That's not enough of a market to support any hardcore research, but enough to have persuaded the pharmaceutical companies to rummage through their databases for something that might do the trick. A lot of people are on their own, infected with viruses that are virtually unique. Imagine how much useful information the health profession can give them. I finally looked up. The expression on her face was one of sympathy, tempered by impatience. I declined the invitation to feel ashamed of my ingratitude. I'd made a fool of myself, but I still had a right to ask the question. I understand all that. I just thought there might be something I could do. You say this drug might work, or it might not. If I could contribute myself to fighting this disease, I'd feel. What? More like a human being and less like a test tube? A passive container in which the wonder drug and the wonder virus would fight it out between themselves. Better. She nodded. I know, but trust me, nothing you can do would make the slightest difference. Just look after yourself as you normally would. Don't catch pneumonia. Don't gain or lose 10 kilos. Don't do anything out of the ordinary. Millions of people must have been exposed to this virus, but the reason you're sick and they're not is a purely genetic matter. The cure will be just the same. The biochemistry that determines whether or not the drug will work for you isn't going to change if you start taking vitamin pills or stop eating junk food. And I should warn you that going on one of those miracle cure diets will simply make you sick. The charlatans selling them ought to be in prison. I nodded in fervent agreement to that, and I felt myself flush with anger. Fraudulent cures had long been my bête noire, although now, for the first time, I could almost understand why other Monte Carlo victims paid good money for such things. Crackpot diets, meditation schemes, aromatherapy, self-hypnosis tapes, you name it. The people who peddled that garbage were the worst kind of cynical parasites, and I'd always thought of their customers as being either congenitally gullible or desperate to the point of abandoning their wits. But there was more to it than that. When your life is at stake, you want to fight for it, with every ounce of your strength, with every cent you can borrow, with every waking moment. Taking one capsule 3 times a day just isn't hard enough. Whereas the schemes of the most perceptive con men were sufficiently arduous, or sufficiently expensive, to make the victims feel that they were engaged in the kind of struggle that the prospect of death requires. This moment of shared anger cleared the air completely. We were on the same side, after all. I'd been acting like a child. I thanked Dr. Packard for her time, picked up the prescription, and left. On my way to the pharmacy, though, I found myself almost wishing that she'd lied to me, that she'd told me my chances would be vastly improved if I ran 10 kilometers a day and ate raw seaweed with every meal. But then I angrily recoiled, thinking, would I really want to be deceived for my own good? If it's down to my DNA, it's down to my DNA, and I ought to expect to be told that simple truth, however unpalatable I find it. And I ought to be grateful that the medical profession has abandoned its old patronizing, paternalistic ways. I was 12 years old when the world learned about the Monte Carlo Project. A team of biological warfare researchers, located just a stone's throw from Las Vegas, alas, the one in New Mexico, not the one in Nevada, had decided that designing viruses was just too much hard work. especially when the Star Wars boys kept hogging all the supercomputers. Why waste hundreds of PhD years? Why expend any intellectual effort whatsoever when the time honored partnership of blind mutuation and natural selection was all that was required? Speeded up substantially, of course. They'd developed a three-part system: a bacterium, a virus, and a line of modified human lymphocytes. A stable portion of the viral genome allowed it to reproduce in the bacterium, while rapid mutation of the rest of the virus was achieved by neatly corrupting the transcription error repair enzymes. The lymphocytes had been altered to vastly amplify the reproductive success of any mutant which managed to infect them, causing it to outbreed those which were limited to using the bacterium. The theory was they'd set up a few trillion copies of this system, like row after row of little biological poker machines, spinning away in their underground lab, and just wait to harvest the jackpots. The theory also included the best containment facilities in the world and 520 people all sticking scrupulously to official procedure, day after day, month after month, without a moment of carelessness, laziness, or forgetfulness. Apparently, nobody bothered to compute the probability of that. The bacterium was supposed to be unable to survive outside artificially beneficent laboratory conditions, but a mutation of the virus came to its aid, filling in for the genes that had been snipped out to make it vulnerable. They wasted too much time using ineffectual chemicals before steeling themselves to nuke the site. By then, the winds had already made any human action, short of melting half a dozen states not an option in an election year, irrelevant. The first rumors proclaimed that we'd all be dead within a week. I can clearly recall the mayhem, the looting, the suicides. Secondhand on the TV screen, our own neighborhood remained relatively tranquil, or numb. States of emergency were declared around the world. Planes were turned away from airports. Ships, which had left their home ports months before the leak, were burned in the docks. Harsh laws were rushed in everywhere to protect public order and public health. Paula and I got to stay home from school for a month. I offered to teach her programming. She wasn't interested. She wanted to go swimming, but the beaches and pools were all closed. It was the summer that I finally managed to hack into a Pentagon computer, just an office supplies purchasing system, but Paula was suitably impressed, and neither of us had ever guessed that paperclips were that expensive. We didn't believe we were going to die, at least not within a week, and we were right. When the hysteria died down, it soon became apparent that only the virus and the bacterium had escaped, and without the modified lymphocytes to fine-tune the selection process, the virus had mutated away from the strain which had caused the initial deaths. However, the cozy symbiotic pair is now found all over the world, endlessly churning out new mutations. Only a tiny fraction of the strains produced are infectious in humans, and only a fraction of those are potentially fatal. A mere 100 or so a year. On the train home, the sun seemed to be in my eyes no matter which way I turned. Somehow, every surface in the carriage caught its reflection. The glare made a headache which had been steadily growing all afternoon almost unbearable, so I covered my eyes with my forearm and faced the floor. With my other hand, I clutched the brown paper bag that held the small glass vial of red and black capsules that would or wouldn't save my life. Cancer. Viral leukemia. I pulled the creased pathology report from my pocket and flipped through it one more time. The last page hadn't magically changed into a happy ending. An oncovirology expert systems declaration of a surefire cure. The last page was just the bill for all the tests. $27,000. At home, I sat and stared at my workstation. 2 months before, when a routine quarterly examination, required by my health insurance company, ever eager to dump the unprofitable sick, had revealed the first signs of trouble. I'd sworn to myself that I'd keep on working, keep on living exactly as if nothing had changed. The idea of indulging in a credit spree or a world trip or some kind of self-destructive binge held no attraction for me at all. Any such final fling would be an admission of defeat. I'd go on a fucking world trip to celebrate my cure, and not before. I had plenty of contract work stacked up, and that pathology bill was already accruing interest. Yet for all that I needed the distraction, for all that I needed the money, I sat there for 3 whole hours and did nothing but brood about my fate. Sharing it with 80,000 strangers scattered about the world was no great comfort. Then it finally struck me. Paula. If I was vulnerable for genetic reasons, then so was she. For identical twins, in the end, we hadn't done too bad a job of pursuing separate lives. She had left home at 16 to tour Central Africa, filming the wildlife and, at considerably greater risk, the poachers. Then she'd gone to the Amazon and become caught up in the land rights struggle there. After that, it was a bit of a blur. She'd always tried to keep me up to date with her exploits, but she moved too fast for my sluggish mental picture of her to follow. I'd never left the country. I haven't even moved house in a decade. She came home only now and then on her way between continents, but we'd stayed in touch electronically, circumstances permitting. They take away your sat phone in Bolivian prisons. The telecommunications multinationals all offer their own expensive services for contacting someone when you don't know in advance what country they're in. The advertising suggests that it's an immensely difficult task. The fact is, every sat phone's location is listed in a central database, which is kept up to date by pooling information from all the regional satellites. Since I happen to have acquired the access codes to consult that database, I could phone Paula directly, wherever she was, without paying the ludicrous surcharge. It was more a matter of nostalgia than miserliness. This minuscule bit of hacking was a token gesture, proof that in spite of impending middle age, I wasn't yet terminally law-abiding, conservative, and dull. I'd automated the whole procedure long ago. The database said she was in Gabon. My program calculated local time, judged 10:23 p.m. to be civilized enough, and made the call. Seconds later, she was on the screen. "Karen, how are you? You look like shit. I thought you were going to call last week. What happened?" The image was perfectly clear, the sound clean and undistorted. Fiber optic cables might be scarce in Central Africa, but geosynchronous satellites are directly overhead. As soon as I set eyes on her, I felt sure she didn't have the virus. She was right. I looked half dead, whereas she was as animated as ever. Half a lifetime spent outdoors meant her skin had aged much faster than mine, but there was always a glow of energy, of purpose, about her that more than compensated. She was close to the lens, so I couldn't see much of the background, but it looked like a fiberglass hut, lit by a couple of hurricane lamps, a step up from the usual tent. "I'm sorry I didn't get around to it. Gabon? Weren't you in Ecuador?" "Yeah, but I met Mohammed. He's a botanist from Indonesia. Actually, we met in Bogota. He was on his way to a conference in Mexico. But why Gabon? This is where he was going next, that's all. There's a fungus here attacking the crops, and I couldn't resist coming along." I nodded, bemused, through 10 minutes of convoluted explanations, not paying too much attention. In 3 months' time, it would all be ancient history. Paula survived as a freelance pop science journalist, darting around the globe. Whoops, lost my place. Nice. Darting around the globe, writing articles for magazines and scripts for TV programs on the latest ecological trouble spots. To be honest, I had severe doubts that this kind of pre-digested eco-babble did the planet any good, but it certainly made her happy. I envied her that. I could not have lived her life. In no sense, in no sense was she the woman I might have been. But nonetheless, it hurt me at times to see in her eyes the kind of sheer excitement that I hadn't felt myself for a decade. My mind wandered while she spoke. Suddenly she was saying, "Karen, are you going to tell me what's wrong?" I hesitated. I had originally planned to tell no one, not even her, and now my reason for calling her seemed absurd. She couldn't have leukemia. It was unthinkable. Then, without even realizing that I'd made the decision, I found myself recounting everything in a dull, flat voice. I watched with a strange feeling of detachment the changing expression on her face: shock, pity, then a burst of fear when she realized, far sooner than I would have done, exactly what my predicament meant for her. What followed was even more awkward and painful than I could have imagined. Her concern for me was genuine, but she would not have been human if the uncertainty of her own position had not begun to prey on her at once, and knowing that made all her fussing seem contrived and false. "Do you have a good doctor? Someone you can trust?" I nodded. "Do you have someone to look after you? Do you want me to come home?" I shook my head, irritated. "No, I'm all right. I'm being looked after. I'm being treated. But you have to get tested as soon as possible." I glared at her, exasperated. I no longer believed that she could have the virus, but I wanted to stress the fact that I'd called her to warn her, not to fish for sympathy. And somehow that finally struck home. She said, quietly, "I'll get tested today. I'll go straight into town, okay?" I nodded. I felt exhausted but relieved. For a moment, all the awkwardness between us melted away. "You'll let me know the results?" She rolled her eyes. "Of course I will." I nodded again. "Okay." "Karen, be careful. Look after yourself." "I will. You too." I hit the escape key. Half an hour later, I took the first of the capsules and climbed into bed. A few minutes later, a bitter taste crept up into my throat. Telling Paula was essential. Telling Martin was insane. I'd only known him 6 months, but I should have guessed exactly how he'd take it. "Move in with me. I'll look after you." "I don't need to be looked after." He hesitated, but only slightly. "Marry me." "Marry you? Why? Do you think I have some desperate need to be married before I die?" He scowled. "Don't talk like that. I love you. Don't you understand that?" I laughed. "I don't mind being pitied. People always say it's degrading, but I think it's a perfectly normal response. But I don't want to have to live with it 24 hours a day." I kissed him, but he kept on scowling. At least I'd waited until after we'd had sex before breaking the news. If not, he probably would have treated me like porcelain. He turned to face me. "Why are you being so hard on yourself? What are you trying to prove? That you're superhuman? That you don't need anyone?" "Listen, you've known from the very start that I need independence and privacy. What do you want me to say? That I'm terrified? Okay, I am. But I'm still the same person. I still need the same things." I slid one hand across his chest and said as gently as I could, "So thanks for the offer, but no thanks." "I don't mean very much to you, do I?" I groaned and pulled a pillow over my face. I thought, "Wake me when you're ready to fuck me again. Does that answer your question?" I didn't say it out loud, though. A week later, Paula phoned me. She had the virus. Her white cell count was up, her red cell count was down. The numbers she quoted sounded just like my own from the month before. They'd even put her on the very same drug. That was hardly surprising, but it gave me an unpleasant claustrophobic feeling when I thought about what it meant. We would both live, or we would both die. In the days that followed, this realization began to obsess me. It was like voodoo, like some curse out of a fairy tale, or the fulfillment of the words she'd uttered the night we became blood sisters. We had never dreamed the same dreams, we'd certainly never loved the same men, but now It was as if we were being punished for failing to respect the forces that bound us together. Part of me knew this was bullshit. Forces that bound us together. It was mental static, the product of stress, nothing more. The truth, though, was just as oppressive. The biochemical machinery would grind out its identical verdict on both of us, for all the thousands of kilometers between us, for all that we had forged separate lives in defiance of our genetic unity. I tried to bury myself in my work. To some degree, I succeeded, if the gray stupor produced by 18-hour days in front of a terminal could really be considered a success. I began to avoid Martin. His puppy dog concern was just too much to bear. Perhaps he meant well, but I didn't have the energy to justify myself to him over and over again. Perversely, at the very same time, I missed our arguments terribly. Resisting his excessive mothering had at least made me feel strong, if only in contrast to the helplessness he seemed to expect of me. I phoned Paula every week at first, but then gradually less and less often. We ought to have been ideal confidants. In fact, nothing could have been less true. Our conversations were redundant. We already knew what the other was thinking far too well. There was no sense of unburdening, just a suffocating, monotonous feeling of recognition. We took to trying to outdo each other in affecting a veneer of optimism, but it was a depressingly transparent effort. Eventually, I thought, if, I get the good news, I'll call her. Until then, what's the point? Apparently, she'd come to the same conclusion. All through childhood, we were forced together. We loved each other, I suppose, but we were always in the same classes at school, bought the same clothes, given the same Christmas and birthday presents, and we were always sick at the same time with the same ailment for the same reason. When she left home, I was envious and horribly lonely for a while, but then I felt a surge of joy, of liberation, because I knew that I had no real wish to follow her, and I knew that from then on our lives could only grow further apart. Now it seemed that had all been an illusion. We would live or die together, and all our efforts to break the bonds had been in vain. About 4 months after the start of treatment, my blood counts began to turn around. I was more terrified than ever of my hopes being dashed, and I spent all my time battling to keep myself from premature optimism. I didn't dare ring Paula. I could think of nothing worse than leading her to think that we were cured, and then turning out to have been mistaken. Even when Dr. Packard, cautiously, almost begrudgingly, admitted that things were looking up, I told myself that she might have relented from her policy of unflinching honesty and decided to offer me some palliative lies. One morning I woke, not yet convinced that I was cured, but sick of feeling I had to drown myself in gloom for fear of being disappointed. If I wanted absolute certainty, I'd be miserable all my life. A relapse would always be possible, or a whole new virus could come along. It was a cold, dark morning, pouring with rain outside, but as I climbed, shivering, out of bed, I felt more cheerful than I had since the whole thing had begun. There was a message in my workstation mailbox tagged "Confidential." It took me 30 seconds to recall the password I needed, and all the while my shivering grew worse. The message was from Chief Administrator of the Libreville People's Hospital, offering his or her condolences on the death of my sister and requesting instructions for the disposal of the body. Sorry. I don't know what I felt first. Disbelief, guilt, confusion, fear. How could she have died when I was so close to recovery? How could she have died without a word to me? How could I have let her die alone? I walked away from the terminal and slumped against the cold brick wall. The worst of it was, I suddenly knew why she'd stayed silent. She must have thought I was dying too, and that was the one thing we'd both feared most of all, dying together. In spite of everything, dying together as if we were one. How could the drug have failed her and worked for me? Had it worked for me? For a moment of sheer paranoia, I wondered if the hospital had been faking my test results, if in fact I was on the verge of death myself. That was ludicrous, though. Why, then, had Paula died? There was only one possible answer. She should have come home. I should have made her come home. How could I have let her stay there in a tropical third world country with her immune system weakened, living in a fiberglass hut, without proper sanitation, probably malnourished? I I should have sent her the money. I should have sent her the ticket. I should have flown out there in person and dragged her back home. Instead, I'd kept her at a distance, afraid of us dying together, afraid of the curse of our sameness. I'd let her die alone. I tried to cry, but something stopped me. I sat in the kitchen, sobbing dryly. I was worthless. I'd killed her with my superstition and cowardice. I had no right to be alive. I spent the next fortnight grappling with the legal and administrative complexities of death in a foreign land. Paula's will requested cremation, but said nothing about where it was to take place, so I arranged for her body and belongings to be flown home. The service was all but deserted. Our parents had died a decade before, in a car crash, and although Paula had had friends all over the world, few were able to make the trip. Martin came, though. When he put an arm around me, I turned and whispered to him angrily, "You didn't even know her. What the hell are you doing here?" He stared at me for a moment, hurt and baffled, then walked off without a word. I can't pretend I wasn't grateful when Packard announced that I was cured, but my failure to rejoice out loud must have puzzled even her. I might have told her about Paula, but I didn't want to be fed cheap cliches about how irrational it was of me to feel guilty for surviving. She was dead. I was growing stronger by the day, often sick with guilt and depression, but more often simply numb. That might easily have been the end of it. Following the instructions in the will, I sent most of her belongings, notebooks, discs, audio and videotapes, to her agent, to be passed on to the appropriate editors and producers, to whom some of it might be of use. All that remained was clothing, a minute quantity of jewelry and cosmetics, and a handful of odds and ends, including a small glass vial of red and black capsules. I don't know what possessed me to take one of the capsules. I had half a dozen left of my own, and Packard had shrugged when I'd asked if I should finish them, and said that it couldn't do me any harm. There was no aftertaste. Every time I'd swallowed my own, within minutes there'd been a bitter aftertaste. I broke open a second capsule and put some of the white powder on my tongue. It was entirely without flavor. I ran and grabbed my own supply and sampled one the same way. It tasted so vile it made my eyes water. I tried, very hard, not to leap to any conclusions. I knew perfectly well that pharmaceuticals were often mixed with inert substances, and perhaps not necessarily the same ones all the time. But why would something bitter be used for that purpose? The taste had to come from the drug itself. The two vials bore the same manufacturer's name and logo, the same brand name, the same generic name, the same formal chemical name for the active ingredient, the same product code, down to the very last digit. Only the batch numbers were different. The first explanation that came to mind was corruption. Although I couldn't recall the details, I was sure that I'd read about dozens of cases of officials in the healthcare systems of developing countries diverting pharmaceuticals for resale on the black market. What better way to cover up such a theft than to replace the stolen product with something else? Something cheap, harmless, and absolutely useless. The gelatin capsules themselves bore nothing but the manufacturer's logo, and since the company probably made at least 1,000 different drugs, it would not have been too hard to find something cheaper with the same size and coloration. I had no idea what to do with this theory. Anonymous bureaucrats in a distant country had killed my sister, but the prospect of finding out who they were, let alone seeing them brought to justice, were infinitesimally small. Even if I'd had real, damning evidence, what was the most I could hope for? A meekly phrased protest from one diplomat to another. I had one of Paula's capsules analyzed. It cost me a fortune, but I was already so deeply in debt that I didn't much care. It was full of a mixture of soluble inorganic compounds. There was no trace of the substance described on the label, nor of anything else with the slightest biological activity. It wasn't a cheap substitute drug, chosen at random. It was a placebo. I stood with the printout in my hand for several minutes, trying to come to terms with what it meant. Simple greed I could have understood, but there was an utterly inhuman coldness here that I couldn't bring myself to swallow. Someone must have made an honest mistake. Nobody could be so callous. Then Packard's words came back to me. Just look after yourself as you normally would. Don't do anything out of the ordinary. Oh no, doctor. Of course not, doctor. Wouldn't want to go spoiling the experiment with any messy, extraneous, uncontrolled factors. I contacted an investigative journalist, one of the best in the country. I arranged a meeting in a small cafe on the edge of town. I drove out there, terrified, angry, triumphant, thinking I had the scoop of the decade, thinking I had dynamite, thinking I was Meryl Streep playing Karen Silkwood. I was dizzy with sweet thoughts of revenge. Heads were going to roll. Nobody tried to run me off the road. The cafe was deserted, and the waiter barely listened to our orders, let alone our conversation. The journalist was very kind. She calmly explained the facts of life. In the aftermath of the Monte Carlo disaster, a lot of legislation had been passed to help deal with the emergency, and a lot of legislation had been repealed. As a matter of urgency, new drugs to treat the new diseases had to be developed and assessed, and the best way to ensure that was to remove the cumbersome regulations that had made clinical trials so difficult and expensive. In the old double blind trials, neither the patients nor the investigators knew who was getting the drug and who was getting a placebo. The information was kept secret by a third party, or a computer. Any improvement observed in the patients who were given the placebo could then be taken into account, and the drug's true efficacy measured. There were two small problems with this traditional approach. Firstly, telling a patient that there's only a 50-50 chance that they've been given a potentially life-saving drug subjects them to a lot of stress. Of course, the treatment and control groups were affected equally, but in terms of predicting what would happen when the drug was finally put out on the market, it introduced a lot of noise into the data. Which side effects were real, and which were artifacts of the patient's uncertainty? Secondly, and more seriously, it had become increasingly difficult to find people willing to volunteer for placebo trials. When you're dying, you don't give a shit about the scientific method. You want the maximum possible chance of surviving. Untested drugs will do if there is no known certain cure. But why expect a further halving of the odds to satisfy some technocrat's obsession with details? Of course, in the good old days, the medical profession could lay down the law to the unwashed masses. Take part in this double-blind trial or crawl away and die. AIDS had changed all that, with black markets for the latest untried cures, straight from the labs to the streets, and intense politicization of the issues. The solution to both flaws was obvious. You lie to the patients. No bill had been passed to explicitly declare that triple-blind trials were legal. If it had, people might have noticed and made a fuss. Instead, as part of the reforms and rationalization that came in the wake of the disaster, all of the laws that might have made them illegal had been removed or watered down. At least, it looked that way. No court had yet been given the opportunity to pass judgment. How could any doctor do that? Lie like that? How could they justify it even to themselves? She shrugged. How did they ever justify double-blind trials? A good medical researcher has to care more about the quality of the data than about any one person's life. And if a double-blind trial is good, a triple-blind trial is better. The data is guaranteed to be better. You can see that, can't you? And the more accurately a drug can be assessed, well, perhaps in the long run, the more lives can be saved. Oh, crap. The placebo effect isn't that powerful. It just isn't that important. Who cares if it's not precisely taken into account? Anyway, two potential cures could still be compared, one treatment against another. That would tell you which drug would save the most lives without any need for placebos. That is done sometimes, although the more prestigious journals look down on those studies. They're less likely to be published. I stared at her. How can you know all this and do nothing? The media could blow it wide open. If you let people know what's going on, she smiled thinly. I could publicize the observations that these practices are now theoretically legal. Other people have done that, and it doesn't exactly make headlines. But if I printed any specific facts about an actual triple-blind trial, I'd face a $500,000 fine and 25 years in prison for endangering public health. Not to mention what they'd do to my publisher. All the emergency laws brought in to deal with the Monte Carlo leak are still active. But that was 20 years ago. She drained her coffee and rose. Don't you recall what the experts said at the time? No. The effects will be with us for generations. It took me 4 months to penetrate the drug manufacturer's network. I eavesdropped on the data flow of several company executives who chose to work from home. It didn't take long to identify the least computer literate. A real bumbling fool who used spreadsheet software to do what the average 5-year-old could have done without fingers and toes. I watched his clumsy responses when the spreadsheet package gave him error messages. He was a gift from heaven. He simply did not have a clue. And best of all, he was forever running a tediously unimaginative pornographic video game. If the computer said, jump, he'd say, promise not to tell. I spent a fortnight minimizing what he had to do. It started out at 70 keystrokes, but I finally got it down to 23. I waited until his screen was at its most compromising, then I suspended his connection to the network and took its place myself. Fatal system error. Type the following to recover. He botched it the first time. I rang alarm bells and repeated the request. The second time, he got it right. The first multi-key combination I had him strike took the workstation right out of its operating system into its processor's microcode debugging routine. The hexadecimal that followed, gibberish to him, was a tiny program to dump all of the workstation's memory down the communications line, right into my lap. If he told anyone with any sense what had happened, suspicion would be aroused at once. But would he risk being asked to explain just what he was running when the bug occurred? I doubted it. I already had his passwords. Included in the workstation's memory was an algorithm which told me precisely how to respond to the network's security challenges. I was in. The rest of their defenses were trivial, at least so far as my aims were concerned. Data that might have been useful to their competitors was well shielded, but I wasn't interested in stealing the secrets of their latest hemorrhoid cure. I could have done a lot of damage. arranged for their backups to be filled with garbage, arranged for the gradual deviation of their accounts from reality until reality suddenly intruded in the form of bankruptcy, or charges of tax fraud. I considered 1,000 possibilities, from the crudest annihilation of data to the slowest, most insidious forms of corruption. In the end, though, I restrained myself. I knew the fight would soon become a political one, and any act of petty vengeance on my part would be sure to be dredged up and used to discredit me, to undermine my cause. So I did only what was absolutely necessary. I located the files containing the names and addresses of everyone who had been unknowingly participating in triple-blind trials of the company's products. I arranged for them all to be notified of what had been done to them. There were over 200,000 people spread all around the world, but I found a swollen executive slush fund which had easily covered the communications bill. Soon, the whole world would know of our anger, would share in our outrage and grief. Half of us were sick or dying, though, and before the slightest whisper of protest was heard, my first objective had to be to save whoever I could. I found the program that allocated medication or placebo, the program that had killed Paula and thousands of others for the sake of sound experimental technique. I altered it. A very small change. I added one more lie. All the reports it generated would continue to assert that half the patients involved in clinical trials were being given the placebo. Dozens of exhaustive, impressive files would continue to be created, containing data entirely consistent with this lie. Only one small file, never read by humans, would be different. The file controlling the assembly line robots would instruct them to put medication in every vial of every batch, from triple blind to quadruple blind. One more lie to cancel out the others until the time for deception was finally over. Martin came to see me. I heard about what you're doing. TIM. Truth in Medicine. He pulled a newspaper clipping from his pocket. A vigorous new organization dedicated to the eradication of quackery, fraud, and deception in both alternative and conventional medicine. Sounds like a great idea. Thanks. He hesitated. I heard you were looking for more volunteers to help around the office. That's right. I could manage 4 hours a week. I laughed. Oh, could you really? Well, thanks very much, but I think we'll cope without you. For a moment, I thought he was going to walk out, but then he said, not so much hurt as simply baffled, Do you want volunteers or not? Yes, but what? If he could swallow enough pride to offer, I could swallow enough pride to accept. I signed him up for Wednesday afternoons. I have nightmares about Paula, now and then. I wake smelling the ghost of a candle flame, certain that she's standing in the dark beside my pillow, a solemn-eyed 9-year-old child again, mesmerized by our strange condition. That child can't haunt me, though. She never died. She grew up, and grew apart from me, and she fought for our separateness harder than I ever did. What if we had died at the very same hour? It would have signified nothing, changed nothing. Nothing could have reached back and robbed us of our separate lives, our separate achievements and failures. I realize now that the blood oath that seemed so ominous to me was nothing but a joke to Paula, her way of mocking the very idea that our fates could be entwined. How could I have taken so long to see that? It shouldn't surprise me, though. The truth, and the measure of her triumph, is that I never really knew her. And that was Blood Sisters by Greg Egan. Ah, good times. In an effort for the medical companies in the wake of a massive biological catastrophe to get accurate, reliable data on various cures for a rapidly mutating disease that makes AIDS and HIV seem like, I don't know, the common cold, basically. Um, they have triple blind trials where patients have no idea if there is even a chance of them being given a placebo or not. So they are getting reliable data. So the woman says, fuck that. I'm having none of this. And hacks their database and makes their computers uh, think that that is still going on, when in reality, that is not what's going on. Alrighty, give me 1 sec. I'm going to take another drink of water and we will start on the next one, Axiomatic. Hmm, sorry. Axiomatic by Greg Egan. Like your brain has been frozen in liquid nitrogen and then smashed into 1,000 shards. I squeezed my way past the teenagers who lounged outside the entrance to the implant store, no doubt fervently hoping for a Holovision news team to roll up and ask them why they weren't in school. They mimed throwing up as I passed, as if the state of not being pubescent and dressed like a member of Binary Search was so disgusting to contemplate that it made them physically ill. Well, maybe it did. Inside, the place was almost deserted. The interior reminded me of a video ROM shop. The display racks were virtually identical, and many of the distributors' logos were the same. Each rack was labeled psychedelia, meditation and healing, motivation and success, languages and technical skills. Each implant, although itself less than half a millimeter across, came in a package the size of an old-style book, bearing gaudy illustrations and a few lines of stale hyperbole from a marketing thesaurus or some rent and endorsement celebrity. Become God. Become the universe. The ultimate insight, the ultimate knowledge, the ultimate trip. Even the perennial, this implant changed my life. I picked up the carton of You Are Great, its transparent, productive wrapper glistening with sweaty fingerprints, and thought numbly, if I bought this thing and used it, I would actually believe that. No amount of evidence to the contrary would be physically able to change my mind. I'd put it back on the shelf, next to Love Yourself a Billion and Instant Willpower, Instant Wealth. I knew exactly what I'd come for, and I knew that it wouldn't be on display. But I browsed a little while longer, partly out of genuine curiosity, partly just to give myself time. Time to think through the implications once again. Time to come to my senses and flee. The cover of Synesthesia showed a blissed out man with a rainbow striking his tongue and musical staves piercing his eyeballs. Beside it, Alien Mindfuck boasted a mental state so bizarre that even as you experience it, you won't know what it's like. Implant technology was originally developed to provide instant language skills for business people and tourists, but after disappointing sales and a takeover by an entertainment conglomerate, the first mass-market implants appeared, a cross between video games and hallucinogenic drugs. Over the years, the range of confusion and dysfunction on offer grew wider. But there's only so far you can take that trend. Beyond a certain point, scrambling the neural connections doesn't leave anyone there to be entertained by the strangeness. And the user, once restored to normalcy, remembers almost nothing. The first of the next generation of implants, the so-called axiomatics, were all sexual in nature. Apparently, that was the technically simplest place to start. I walked over to the erotica section to see what was available, or at least what could be legally displayed. Homosexuality, heterosexuality, autoeroticism, an assortment of harmless fetishes, erotizations of various unlikely parts of the body. Why, I wondered, would anyone choose to have their brain rewired to make them crave a sexual practice they otherwise would have found abhorrent, or ludicrous, or just plain boring? To comply with a partner's demands? Maybe, although such extreme submissiveness was hard to imagine and could scarcely be sufficiently widespread to explain the size of the market. To enable a part of their own sexual identity, which, unaided, would have merely nagged and festered, to triumph over their inhibitions, their ambivalence, their revulsion? Everyone has conflicting desires, and people can grow tired of both wanting and not wanting the very same thing. I understood that perfectly. The next rack contained a selection of religions, everything from Amish to Zen. Gaining the Amish disapproval of technology this way apparently posed no problem. Virtually every religious implant enabled the user to embrace far stranger contradictions. There was even an implant called Secular Humanist. You will hold these truths to be self-evident. No vacillating agnostic, though. Apparently there was no market for doubt. For a minute or two, I lingered. For a mere $50, I could have bought back my childhood Catholicism, even if the church would not have approved. At least, not officially. It would have been interesting to know exactly who was subsidizing the product. In the end, though, I had to admit that I wasn't really tempted. Perhaps it would have solved my problem, but not in the way that I wanted it solved. And after all, getting my own way was the whole point of coming here. Using an implant wouldn't rob me of my free will. On the contrary, it was going to help me assert it. Finally, I steeled myself and approached the sales counter. "How can I help you, sir?" The young man smiled at me brightly, radiating sincerity, as if he really enjoyed his work. I mean, really, really. I've come to pick up a special order. Your name, please, sir? Carver. Mark. He reached under the counter and emerged with a parcel, mercifully already wrapped in anonymous brown. I paid in cash. I brought the exact change, $399.95. It was all over in 20 seconds. I left the store, sick with relief, triumphant, exhausted. At least I'd finally bought the fucking thing. It was in my hands now, no one else was involved, and all I had to do was decide whether or not to use it. After walking a few blocks toward the train station, I tossed the parcel into a bin, but I turned back almost at once and retrieved it. I passed a pair of armored cops, and I pictured their eyes boring into me from behind their mirrored faceplates, but what I was carrying was perfectly legal. How could the government ban a device which did no more than engender, in those who freely chose to use it, a particular set of beliefs, without also arresting everyone who shared those beliefs naturally? Very easily, actually, since the law didn't have to be consistent. But the implant manufacturers had succeeded in convincing the public that restricting their products would be paving the way for the thought police. By the time I got home, I was shaking uncontrollably. I put the parcel on my kitchen table and started pacing. This wasn't for Amy. I had to admit that. Just because I still loved her and still mourned her didn't mean I was doing this for her. I wouldn't soil her memory with that lie. In fact, I was doing it to free myself from her. After 5 years, I wanted my pointless love, my useless grief, to finally stop ruling my life. Nobody could blame me for that. She had died in an armed holdup in a bank. The security cameras had been disabled, and everyone apart from the robbers had spent most of the time face down on the floor, so I never found out the whole story. She must have moved, fidgeted, looked up. She must have done something. Even at the peaks of my hatred, I couldn't believe that she'd been killed on a whim, for no comprehensible reason at all. I knew who had bleh. I knew who had squeezed the trigger, though. It hadn't come out at the trial. A clerk in the police department had sold me the information. The killer's name was Patrick Anderson, and by turning prosecution witness, he'd put his accomplices away for life and reduced his own sentence to 7 years. I went to the media. A loathsome crime show personality had taken the story and ranted about it on the airwaves for a week, diluting the facts with self-serving rhetoric, then grown bored and moved on to something else. 5 years later, Anderson had been out on parole for 9 months. Okay, so what? It happens all the time. If someone had come to me with such a story, I would have been sympathetic but firm. Forget her. She's dead. Forget him. He's garbage. Get on with your life. I didn't forget her, and I didn't forget her killer. I had loved her, whatever that meant, and while the rational part of me, had swallowed the fact of her death, the rest kept twitching like a decapitated snake. Someone else in the same state might have turned the house into a shrine, covered every wall and mantelpiece with photographs and memorabilia, put fresh flowers on her grave every day, and spent every night getting drunk watching old home movies. I didn't do that. I couldn't. It would have been grotesque and utterly false. Sentimentality had always made both of us violently ill. I kept a single photo. We hadn't made home movies. I visited her grave once a year. Yet for all of this outward restraint, inside my head, my obsession with Amy's death simply kept on growing. I didn't want it. I didn't choose it. I didn't feed it or encourage it in any way. I kept no electronic scrapbook of the trial. If people raised the subject, I walked away. I buried myself in my work. In my spare time, I read or I went to the movies alone. I thought about searching for someone new, but never did anything about it, always putting it off until that time in the indefinite future when I would be human again. Every night, the details of the incident circled in my brain. I thought of 1,000 things I might have done to have prevented her death. From not marrying her in the first place, we'd moved to Sydney because of my job, to magically arriving at the bank as her killer took aim, tackling him to the ground and beating him senseless or worse. I knew these fantasies were futile and self-indulgent, but that knowledge was no cure. If I took sleeping pills, the whole thing simply shifted to the daylight hours, and I was literally unable to work. The computers that help us are slightly less appalling every year, but air traffic controllers can't daydream. I had to do something. Revenge? Revenge was for the morally retarded. Me? I'd signed petitions to the UN calling for the worldwide unconditional abolition of capital punishment. I'd meant it then, and I still meant it. Taking human life was wrong. I'd believed that passionately since childhood. Maybe it started out as religious dogma, but when I grew up and shed all the ludicrous claptrap, the sanctity of life was one of the few beliefs I judged to be worth keeping. Aside from any pragmatic reasons, human consciousness had always seemed to me the most astonishing, miraculous, sacred thing in the universe. Blame my upbringing. Blame my upbringing. Blame my genes. I could no more devalue it than believe that 1 plus 1 equals 0. Tell some people you're a pacifist, and in 10 seconds flat, they'll invent a situation in which millions of people will die in unspeakable agony, and all your loved ones will be raped and tortured if you don't blow someone's brains out. There's always a contrived reason why you can't merely wound the omnipotent, genocidal madman. The amusing thing is, they seem to hold you in even greater contempt when you admit that, yes, you'd do it. You would kill under those conditions. Anderson, however, was clearly not an omnipotent genocidal madman. I had no idea whether or not he was likely to kill again. As for his capacity for reform, his abused childhood, or the caring and compassionate alter ego that may have been hiding behind the facade of his brutal exterior, I didn't really give a shit. But nonetheless, I was convinced that it would be wrong for me to kill him. I bought the gun first. That was easy and perfectly legal. Perhaps the computers simply failed to correlate my permit application with the release of my wife's killer, or perhaps the link was detected but judged irrelevant. I joined a sports club full of people who spent 3 hours a week doing nothing but shooting at moving, human-shaped targets. A recreational activity, harmless as fencing. I practiced saying that with a straight face. Buying the anonymous ammunition from a fellow club member was illegal. Bullets that vaporized on impact, leaving no ballistics evidence linking them to a specific weapon. I scanned the court records. The average sentence for possessing such things was a $500 fine. The silencer was illegal too. The penalties for ownership were similar. Every night I thought it through. Every night I came to the same conclusion. Despite my elaborate preparations, I wasn't going to kill anyone. Part of me wanted to, part of me didn't, but I knew perfectly well which was strongest. I'd spent the rest of my life dreaming about it. I'd spend the rest of my life dreaming about it, safe in the knowledge that no amount of hatred or grief or desperation would ever be enough to make me act against my nature. Excuse me. I unwrapped the parcel. I was expecting a garish cover, sneering bodybuilder toting submachine gun. But the package was unadorned, plain gray with no markings except for the product code and the name of the distributor, Clockwork Orchard. I'd ordered the thing through an online catalog, accessed via a coin-driven public terminal, and I'd specified collection by Mark Carver at a branch of the implant store in Chatswood, far from my home, all of which was paranoid nonsense since the implant was legal, and all of which was perfectly reasonable because I felt far more nervous and guilty about buying it than I did about buying the gun and ammunition. The description in the catalog had begun with the statement, "Life is cheap," and then had waffled on for several lines in the same vein. "People are meat. They're nothing. They're worthless." The exact words weren't important, though. They weren't a part of the implant itself. It wouldn't be a matter of a voice in my head reciting some badly written spiel which I could choose to ridicule or ignore. Nor would it be a kind of mental legislative decree which I could evade by means of semantic quibbling. Axiomatic implants were derived from analysis of actual neural structures in real people's brains. They weren't based on the expression of the axioms in language. The spirit, not the letter, of the law would prevail. I opened up the carton. There was an instruction leaflet in 17 languages, a programmer, an applicator, a pair of tweezers. Sealed in a plastic bubble labeled sterile if unbroken, the implant itself looked like a tiny piece of gravel. I had never used one before, but I'd seen it done 1,000 times on Holovision. You placed the thing in the programmer, woke it up, and told it how long you wanted it to be active. The applicator was strictly for tyros. The jaded cognoscenti balanced the implant on the top of their little finger and daintily poked it up the nostril of their choice. The implant burrowed into the brain, sent out a swarm of nanomachines to explore and forge links with the relevant neural systems, and then went into active mode for the predetermined time, anything from an hour to infinity, doing whatever it was designed to do. Enabling multiple orgasms of the left kneecap, making the color blue taste like the long-lost memory of mother's milk, or hardwiring a premise. I will succeed. I am happy in my job. There is life after death. Nobody died in Belsen. 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. I packed everything back into the carton, put it in a drawer, took 3 sleeping pills, and went to bed. Perhaps it was a matter of laziness. I've always been biased towards those options which spare me from facing the very same set of choices again in the future. It seems so inefficient to go through the same agonies of conscience more than once. To not use the implant would have meant having to reaffirm that decision day after day for the rest of my life. Or perhaps I never really believed that the preposterous toy would work. Perhaps I hoped to prove that my convictions, unlike other people's, were engraved on some metaphysical tablet that hovered in a spiritual dimension, unreachable by any mere machine. Or perhaps I just wanted a moral alibi, a way to kill Anderson while still believing it was something that the real me could never have done. At least I'm sure of one thing. I didn't do it for Amy. I woke around dawn of the next day, although I didn't need to get up at all. I was on annual leave for a month. I dressed, ate breakfast, then unpacked the implant again and carefully read the instructions. With no great sense of occasion, I broke open the sterile bubble and, with the tweezers, dropped the speck into its cavity in the programmer. The programmer said, "Do you speak English?" The voice reminded me of one of the control towers at work, deep but somehow genderless, businesslike without being crudely robotic, and yet unmistakably inhuman. Yes. "Do you want to program this implant?" Yes. "Please specify the active period." 3 days. 3 days would be enough, surely. If not, I'd call the whole thing off. "This implant is to remain active for 3 days after insertion. Is that correct?" Yes. "This implant is ready for use. The time is 7:43 a.m. Please insert the implant before 8:43 a.m., or it will deactivate itself and reprogramming will be required. Please enjoy this product and dispose of the packaging thoughtfully." I placed the implant in the applicator, then hesitated, but not for long. This wasn't the time to agonize. I'd agonized for months, and I was sick of it. Any more indecisiveness, and I'd need to buy a second implant to convince me to use the first. I wasn't committing a crime. I wasn't even coming close to guaranteeing that I would commit one. Millions of people held the belief that human life was nothing special, but how many of them were murderers? The next 3 days would simply reveal how I reacted to that belief. And although the attitude would be hardwired, the consequences were far from certain. I put the applicator in my left nostril and pushed the release button. There was a brief stinging sensation, nothing more. I thought Amy would have despised me for this. That shook me, but only for a moment. Amy was dead, which made her hypothetical feelings irrelevant. Nothing I did could hurt her now, and thinking any other way was crazy. I tried to monitor the progress of the change, but that was a joke. You can't check your moral precepts by introspection every 30 seconds. After all, my assessment of myself as being unable to kill had been based on decades of observation, much of it probably out of date. What's more, that assessment, that self-image, had come to be as much a cause of my actions and attitudes as a reflection of them. And apart from the direct changes the implant was making to my brain, it was breaking that feedback loop by providing a rationalization for me to act in a way that I'd convinced myself was impossible. After a while, I decided to get drunk, to distract myself from the vision of microscopic robots crawling around in my skull. It was a big mistake. Alcohol makes me paranoid. I don't recall much of what followed, except for catching sight of myself in the bathroom mirror screaming, "Hal's breaking first law! Hal's breaking first law!" before vomiting copiously. I woke just after midnight on the bathroom floor. I took an anti-hangover pill, and in 5 minutes my headache and nausea were gone. I showered and put on fresh clothes. I'd bought a jacket especially for the occasion, with a pocket inside for the gun. It was still impossible to tell if the thing had done anything to me that went beyond the placebo effect. I asked myself, out loud, is human life sacred? Is it wrong to kill? But I couldn't concentrate on the question, and I found it hard to believe that I ever had in the past. The whole idea seemed obscure and difficult, like some esoteric mathematical theorem. The prospect of going ahead with my plans made my stomach churn, but that was simple fear, not moral outrage. The implant wasn't meant to make me brave or calm or resolute. I could have bought those qualities too, but that would have been cheating. I'd had Anderson checked out by a private investigator. He worked every night but Sunday as a bouncer in a Surrey Hills nightclub. He lived nearby and usually arrived home on foot or at around 4 in the morning. I'd driven past his terrace house several times. I'd have no trouble finding it. He lived alone. He had a lover, but they always met at her place in the afternoon or early evening. I loaded the gun and put it in my jacket, then spent half an hour staring at the mirror, trying to decide if the bulge was visible. I wanted a drink, but I restrained myself. I switched on the radio and wandered through the house, trying to become less agitated. Perhaps taking a life was now no big deal to me, but I could still end up dead, or in prison, and the implant apparently hadn't rendered me uninterested in my own fate. I left too early, and had to drive by a circuitous route to kill time. Even then, it was only 3:15 when I parked, a kilometer from Anderson's house. A few cars and taxis passed me as I walked the rest of the way, and I'm sure I was trying so hard to look at ease that my body language radiated guilt and paranoia. But no ordinary driver would have noticed or cared, and I didn't see a single patrol car. When I reached the place, there was nowhere to hide. No gardens, no trees, no fences. But I'd known that in advance. I chose a house across the street, not quite opposite Anderson's, and sat on the front step. If the occupant appeared, I'd feign drunkenness and stagger away. I sat and waited. It was a warm, still, ordinary night. The sky was clear, but gray and starless thanks to the lights of the city. I kept reminding myself, you don't have to do this. You don't have to go through with it. So why did I stay? The hope of being liberated from my sleepless nights? The idea was laughable. I had no doubt that if I killed Anderson, it would torture me as much as my helplessness over Amy's death. Why did I stay? It was nothing to do with the implant. At most, that was neutralizing my qualms. It wasn't forcing me to do anything. Why then? In the end, I think I saw it as a matter of honesty. I had to accept the unpleasant fact that I honestly wanted to kill Anderson, and however much I had also been repelled by the notion, to be true to myself, I had to do it. Anything less would have been hypocrisy and self-deception. At 5 to 4, I heard footsteps echoing down the street. As I turned, I hoped it would be someone else, or that he would be with a friend, but it was him, and he was alone. I waited until he was as far from his front door as I was, then I started walking. He glanced my way briefly, then ignored me. I felt a shock of pure fear. I hadn't seen him in the flesh since that trial, and I'd forgotten how physically imposing he was. I had to force myself to slow down, and even then I passed him sooner than I'd meant to. I was wearing light, rubber-soled shoes. He was in heavy boots, but when I crossed the street and did a U-turn toward him, I couldn't believe he couldn't hear my heartbeat or smell the stench of my sweat. Meters from the door, just as I finished pulling out the gun, he looked over his shoulder with an expression of bland curiosity, as if he might have been expecting a dog or a piece of wind-blown litter. He turned to face me, frowning. I just stood there, pointing the gun at him, unable to speak. Eventually, he said, "What the fuck do you want? I've got $200 in my wallet. Back pocket." I shook my head. "Unlock the front door, then put your hands to your head and kick it open. Don't try closing it on me." He hesitated, then complied. "Now walk in. Keep your hands on your head. 5 steps, that's all. Count them out loud. I'll be right behind you." I reached the light switch for the hall as he counted 4, then I slammed the door behind me and flinched at the sound. Anderson was right in front of me, and I suddenly felt trapped. The man was a vicious killer. I hadn't even thrown a punch since I was 8 years old. Did I really believe the gun would protect me? With his hands on his head, the muscles of his arms and shoulders bulged against his shirt. I should have shot him right then, in the back of the head. This was an execution, not a duel. If I'd wanted some quaint idea of honor, I could have come without a gun and let him take me to pieces. I said, "Turn left." Left was the living room. I followed him in, switched on the light. "Sit." I stood in the doorway. He sat in the room's only chair. For a moment, I felt dizzy, and my vision seemed to tilt, but I don't think I moved. I don't think I sagged or swayed. If I had, he probably would have rushed me. "What do you want?" he asked. I had to give that a lot of thought. I'd fantasized this situation 1,000 times, but I could no longer remember the details. Although I did recall that I'd usually assumed that Anderson would recognize me and start volunteering excuses and explanations straight away. Finally, I said, "I want you to tell me why you killed my wife." "I didn't kill your wife. Miller killed your wife." I shook my head. "That's not true. I know. The cops told me. Don't bother lying because I know." He stared at me blandly. I wanted to lose my temper and scream, but I had a feeling that, in spite of the gun, that would have been more comical than intimidating. I could have pistol whipped him, but the truth is I was afraid to go near him. So I shot him in the foot. He yelped and swore, then leaned over to inspect the damage. "Fuck you!" he hissed. "Fuck you!" He rocked back and forth, holding his foot. "I'll break your fucking neck! I'll fucking kill you!" The wound bled a little through the hole in his boot, but it was nothing compared to the movies. I'd heard that the vaporizing ammunition had a cauterizing effect. I said, "Tell me why you killed my wife." He looked far more angry and disgusted than afraid, but he dropped his pretense of innocence. "It just happened," he said. "It was just one of those things that happens." I shook my head, annoyed. "No. Why? Why did it happen?" He moved as if to take off his boot, then thought better of it. "Things were going wrong. There was a time lock. There was hardly any cash. Everything was just a big fuck up. I didn't mean to do it. It just happened." I shook my head again, unable to decide if he was a moron or if he was stalling. "Don't tell me it just happened. Why did it happen? Why did you do it?" The frustration was mutual. He ran a hand through his hair and scowled at me. He was sweating now, but I couldn't tell if it was from pain or from fear. "What do you want me to say? I lost my temper, all right. Things were going badly, and I lost my fucking temper. And there she was, all right." The dizziness struck me again, but this time it didn't subside. I understood now. He wasn't being obtuse. He was telling the entire truth. I'd smashed the occasional coffee cup during a tense situation at work. I'd even, to my shame, kicked our dog once after a fight with Amy. Why? I'd lost my fucking temper, and there she was. I stared at Anderson and felt myself grinning stupidly. It was all so clear now. I understood. I understood the absurdity of everything I'd ever felt for Amy. My love, my grief. It had all been a joke. She was meat. She was nothing. All the pain of the past 5 years evaporated. I was drunk with relief. I raised my arms and spun around slowly. Anderson leaped up and sprung toward me. I shot him in the chest until I ran out of bullets. Then I knelt down beside him. He was dead. I put the gun in my jacket. The barrel was warm. I remembered to use my handkerchief to open the front door. I half expected to find a crowd outside, but of course the shots had been inaudible, and Anderson's threats and curses were not likely to have attracted attention. A block from the house, a patrol car appeared around a corner. It slowed almost to a halt as it approached me. I kept my eyes straight ahead as it passed. I heard the engine idle, then stop. I kept walking, waiting for a shouted command, thinking, if they search me and find the gun, I'll confess. There's no point in prolonging the agony. The engine spluttered, revved noisily, and the car roared away. Perhaps I'm not the number one most obvious suspect. I don't know what Anderson was involved with since he got out. Maybe there are hundreds of other people who had far better reasons for wanting him dead, and perhaps when the cops have finished with them, they'll get around to asking me what I was doing that night. A month seems an awfully long time, though. Anyone would think they didn't care. The same teenagers as before are gathered around the entrance, and again the mere sight of me seems to disgust them. I wonder if the taste in fashion and music tattooed on their brains is set to fade in a year or two, or if they have sworn lifelong allegiance. It doesn't bear contemplating. This time, I don't browse. I approach the sales counter without hesitation. This time, I know exactly what I want. What I want is what I felt that night, the unshakable conviction that Amy's death, let alone Anderson's, simply didn't matter, any more than the death of a fly or an amoeba, any more than breaking a coffee cup or kicking a dog. My one mistake was thinking that the insight I gained would simply vanish when the implant cut out. It hasn't. It's been clouded with doubts and reservations. It's been undermined, to some degree, by my whole ridiculous panoply of beliefs and superstitions. But I can still recall the peace it gave me. I can still recall that flood of joy and relief, and I want it back. Not for 3 days. For the rest of my life. Killing Anderson wasn't honest. It wasn't being true to myself. Being true to myself would have meant living with all my contradictory urges, suffering the multitude of voices in my head, accepting confusion and doubt. It's too late for that now. Having tasted the freedom of certainty, I find I can't live without it. How can I help you, sir? The salesman smiles from the bottom of his heart. Part of me, of course, still finds the prospect of what I am about to do totally repugnant. No matter, it that won't last. And that was Axiomatic by Greg Egan. It's good stuff, folks. I live for science fiction like that. I don't know about any of the rest of you. Hope the rest of you are enjoying these. I think that one's cool. So, in this hypothetical future, we have the technology to basically rewrite your brain so that your thoughts and convictions are negotiable. They are programmable. Because hey, what is human personality? What are human thoughts and convictions, if not results of our programming, if you will? Um, and in this case, the guy wants to get over his hangups and bugaboos about taking human life until he's right there and he realizes that really he wants to get over caring about the death of his ex-wife. Well, now ex-wife. It's romantic and really depressing at the same time, I guess. Mostly really depressing, um, but uh, but I think it's really good. I think it's very human, actually, to want something like that. All right, I think I am going to call it at that, though, for this week. I will not have one of these next week. I am not going to be around next a bunch of the next week. Like the latter half of the week, I'm not going to be here. But the week after that, I will try and make it an extra long one. Um, Thanks so much for tuning in. Hopefully, I'll be over this head cold in the next day or two. And thanks for tuning in. And have a great day. Hope you enjoyed. See you next time.